Welcome to the book club interview. My name is Scott Hollister, your host. This is the first time we've ever had a part two with George Antone. He wrote The Banker's Code, and we're going to get into The Debt Millionaire as well. So, George, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you here again.
Thanks. I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, I am, and I loved our talk in between, and we're just talking about our favorite books and your writing style and how you like to keep stories interesting, right? You love a good story that's moving forward, and we're talking about finance books, and I think that's so important, and that's why I loved your book. You caught me with that story, right? I was flipping through those pages, and for whatever reason, when there's a good story, you cling to the pages a little bit
Yep.
more. So.
I have to tell you what inspired me, Scott, was when I read Robert Kiyosaki's books, especially Rich Dad Poor Dad. Something he said that was fascinating to me is he said, I'm not the best writer, and I probably suck in writing. However, I wanted to share this information, and it changed my life. So many books have had such a huge impact, and I honestly never cared about how it was written, like in terms of the grammar and all that stuff. I just
Mhm.
wanted, it just was so moving and impactful that I decided, you know what, it is completely okay to write a book, even if I suck at writing. And but it's just whatever moved me, and that I wanted to share with the world. So thank you for those kind words.
I'm glad you did because I love the Banker's Code, and you really caught me with another story in chapter one, and you talked about the secret lies of the game Monopoly, and we all love that game. I'm sure everybody's grown up at least played it a few times. What's the secret? You said is it buying four green homes and a hotel? And you said nope, that's not the way to win. Is it buying Park Place? And nope, not that either. So what's the secret to winning the game Monopoly?
I love that analogy because it's so true. If you think about Monopoly, we all get excited about you know wanting to play the game, and we all pick our favorite pieces, and we all run around the board, and but we never really step back to think about who's really winning the game every time, and it's really the bank. The bank
Hmm.
always wins. In fact, if you read the rules carefully, there are really two sets of rules. One is for the player, meaning the investor, and one is for the banker. And in fact, you see how much power the banker has in the game, but also in real life. If you look at, every building in the world, the biggest buildings in the world, biggest buildings in every city, they're all banks. And but that's in real life too. It's so in Monopoly, the banker wins, and also because they know how to play the game of finance, and so it's a fascinating story. Yeah.
Hmm. I loved it. Yeah. So
Yeah.
game of finance, and you go into private lenders. So why would someone use a private lender over a bank, and why would they pay more?
So for borrowers, so I want everyone to think about this for a second. If you find a property that's worth, let's just say whatever, it's worth 200,000, but it's worth 400,000, as an example, and you have 1 week to close, and if you go to a bank, the bank is going to tell you, there's no guarantee we're going to give you the loan, and it's going to take 30 days, and they could, at any point, you could not get qualified. But a private individual that has the money might say, you know what, I'm willing to lend you the money. However, I want to charge you more because obviously, if I'm going to lend someone money, I could put my money into something and paying me whatever 6, 7%, or I could put it somewhere else and make 10, 12% with someone who it's a low risk deal. So obviously, a private lender will want to charge more because they have other places to put it. But as a borrower, you have this great deal that you're about to lose, and you have literally 1 or 2 weeks to close on this deal. So obviously, you're willing to pay 10% or 12% per year, but you're only keeping the money for 6 months, and you can turn around and sell it and make some money. So that's why borrowers will always go to private lenders if they have a good, hot, smoking deal, and they're willing to pay more because they're about to make so much more money from that money. And so for them, the borrowers, the certainty of getting the money in a very specific time frame is more
Hmm.
important to them than the cost of money because they know they're going to ultimately make more money anyway. So So
Well
that's why
said.
there's a need for private money much more than banks for for certain deals.
Uh, and that goes back to what we talked about in the first interview is that capital stack and making sure you have the right one that
Right.
was more for buy and hold, but when the fix and flip, you can you could structure that a little bit more aggressively.
That's correct. That's correct.
So you talk about hypothecation in the book. Can you expand on why that is so important?
Yeah. So the word hypothecation and specifically rehypothecation, I'm going to add the letters re before that. Rehypothecation is probably the most important word in banking, and it allows bankers and lenders to make money off of, or let me say that. If I was to lend you money, for example, Scott, and you gave me a deed of trust or mortgage, so I'm lending you money against your property, and I have a piece of paper from you. I can use that piece of paper as collateral to borrow more money to lend out to someone else. So let's just say that I lend you 100,000 and you're paying me say 10%, and I can use that as collateral to borrow money say at 7%. So now you're paying me 12 or 10 or whatever we said. I'm paying 7 to the person I just borrowed the money or the bank, and then I can turn around and use that money to do another loan. So rehypothecation is allowing me to reuse that piece of paper as collateral for the next loan. And that's what banks do. They lend all that money out, and then they use these loans as collateral to borrow more money. That's called rehypothecation. It is one of the most brilliant things out there for people who want to learn more about how to turn money and how to use the powerful strategies of banks. They have to learn what's called rehypothecation. Very, very, very powerful word.
Interesting. Is there a sample deal that so you lend me 100K at 10%, and you get that deed of trust, right? And
Hmm.
sorry, I want to re-explain. I'm
Yeah,
trying to grasp. And you go to the bank, and that's secured from them, and you borrow more debt.
correct. So let's just say
Yeah.
your property, just to expand, add more detail. Let's just say your property is worth 160,000. Okay, and I lend you 70% of that, so $100,000. So now my money is in a lower risk position because you have so much to lose if you don't pay me, right?
Hmm.
I might end up with a $160,000 asset for the 100,000. So it's a good deal for me, and I'm in first position. So at this point,
Hmm.
I've secured my not secured, but I have the collateral, I have the security, and it's low risk for me. So now I have this deed of trust that's signed by you that says $100,000 at whatever 10%. Now I can use that piece of paper as collateral. It could be to a bank or it could be to other individuals, right? And borrow against it. So let's just say I borrowed 90,000 against it, or 80,000, or 100,000 even, and now I have access to my money. So you're paying me 10%. I'm paying the source of money, let's just say 7%, and now I have my 100,000 to do a second loan like that, right? So now I can turn the money over and over again.
Okay, so you're making the arbitrage on the 6% or 7% you're paying. You're getting the 10, so you're
Correct.
making 3,
Correct.
and then you go lend out again to make another 3 or so.
Exactly. That's
Okay.
exactly correct. And then the other person's going to give me a deed of trust or mortgage, depending on the state. And then I can
Hmm.
use that, and that's called the rehypothecation, right? Is because
Okay.
I am re borrowing against the same or for another security, another piece of
Interesting.
security.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So, in the Banker's Code, you talk about the 3 teams of people in the world. Can you expand on that?
So yeah, so in terms of if you think about the whole world, uh, everyone can be divided into one of 3 groups or 3 teams. One are the consumers, and that's the biggest group, and the consumers consume, right, products and services. And the other team are the producers, and the producers are typically, like small businesses and or businesses just in general, and they produce products and services for the consumers to consume, and that's the second team. And the third team are the bankers, and the bankers are the smallest group in this among these three teams, and they're the ones lending money to both sides, to the producers and to the consumers, but they're also using the producer and consumers' money to turn around and lend back to them. And so they are playing the game of finance. The producers are in the game of businesses, or a business running a business and selling products and services, and investors fall under producers, and finally the consumers. So the consumers make money by working a job for the producers. The producers make money by selling to the consumers, and the banks make money by creating spreads from the producer and consumers' money, and they take on the lowest risk possible. And if you think about businesses, we all know that the highest risk of failure is among businesses. So the producers have a high risk of failure, and the banks have the lowest risk of failure in this whole game. So really, everyone falls into one of those three teams. And so they have to then decide, which team do I belong to, as a producer, as a consumer, or as a lender. Now, just to add one more thing to that, the people that play even the bigger game are the ones that actually do producers and finance and bankers, and I call them financiers because they play even a bigger game. But I won't go there right now. But these are the three major teams.
All right, let's talk about the secret formula in the third book. Can you expand on why that is so important?
So when I was working at Intuit, I was working on two products as a software developer. One was Quicken, and one was Quicken Financial Planner. And when I was programming these, we have to know, the formulas and all that stuff. So we have to go into a lot of details. So one of the things I discovered in there was this formula that is so impactful that I felt everyone in the world should know. So let me give you an analogy first, and then I'll go into the formula and how it affects all of us, no matter whether investing or not. So imagine you're in a race, okay? And you start running in this race. And as you're running this race, you look up and you see the finish line, except the finish line is moving away from you, and it's moving away from you at a faster pace than you're moving towards it. So even though you're running forward, you're really running backwards relative to the finish line, right? So the first question you think about is not just about running, but you're thinking about how fast should I run? So how fast is the finish line moving away from me, and how much faster should I run to catch up to the finish line? So the finish line represents the financial system. Now, the first question you have to ask yourself is at what pace is the finish line moving away? So let's just take an example. If the finish line is moving away from you at 10 miles an hour, so you have to run faster than that, obviously. So it turns out that you can actually measure how fast the finish line is moving away from you. And so no matter what you invest in, it doesn't matter any of this stuff. The question is, what am I going to do to catch up to the finish line? Because that's the financial system. So at the point of retirement, I have to have a certain amount of money to catch up. So what happens is, it turns out that there is a formula that allows you to calculate how fast the finish line is moving, and then you have to beat that number. So let's turn those numbers into percentages. If you find out that the finish line is moving at 8% away from you, that means your whole portfolio needs to be generating more than 8%, okay? So you have to be generating 9%, 10% just to catch up to the finish line. Mm-hmm. Now, most people are happy generating 6% and 5%, and they're showing off, but they're really moving backwards relative to the finish line, right? So it turns out that you can actually calculate, and I have the formula here. I'll show it to you on the camera, but we also can give it to you on the notes. So if you look at this formula here, I'm going to put it on the screen. It's B, which stands for break even. I'll talk about what that means. And on top you have I for inflation. And in the bottom you have, in the denominator, you have 1 minus R. R is the effective tax rate. Now all you have to do is plug in those numbers. So for your effective tax rate, just ask your accountant, what's my effective tax rate? And so let's just say they give you, for example, 40%. Okay. So you'd plug in 40% in there. For inflation, you plug in the number. In this case, let's just say 6%. I mean, we know inflation is higher than what the government tells us. Let's just say for now it's 6%. So 0.06 on top. When you plug in those numbers, you have 6% on top, and you have 1 minus 40% in the bottom, which is 60%. That gives you a break even of 10% in this example. What does that mean? That means you have to generate a 10% without using tax, without using a debt. You have to generate a 10% return, every single year in a compounding manner, just to keep up with the financial, what's called the purchasing power. Think about that for a second. In this example, 10% every single year in a compounding manner without using debt. Where on earth can you do that without using debt? So that means you can't say, I'm going to buy real estate with debt, right? I'm talking strictly here. This formula affects all of us. It doesn't matter what you invest in, stocks, mutual funds, real estate, move all that aside. You have to beat this in order to keep moving forward. So it turns out for you to be able to beat this, you have to take significantly more risk in your investing. Well, that's unacceptable for most of us, including myself. So the only way to beat this is to actually use debt strategically. And so what happens is, as I started playing with this, I realized that if you multiply I by M, and I'm going to just show you here. Okay, like the M, I added M is my money in the deal. In other words, what percentage of my money is in the deal versus debt. So, and if you remember in part one, I talked about inflation gets passed on, the negative side of inflation gets passed on to the lender, right? So what happened with break even is for you to beat or to run faster towards the finish line, you have to use debt. And you have to use debt against stable assets. That's why real estate is so fascinating, but you can do it with other things. In other words, what am I saying here? You have to know this formula because there's nothing worse than waking up when it's too late and finding out that all these years I've been making money, but I'm actually moving backwards toward relative to the purchasing power. And so that's the problem with most investors, is that they're happy making 5-6%, but they're technically moving backwards relative to the finish line or the purchasing power. And they only find out when it's too late. Ask anyone who's retired and tell them what did they learn, and they realize the purchasing power, they made money, but they can't afford the same things they used to 20 years ago because they weren't aware of this formula. So now that you know this and you realize that that's why we have to use debt strategically in order to improve our purchasing power. So now that you know this, the question is how to use debt. And that's what we talked about in part one, is understanding debt, because having too much debt or too little debt, too much debt is high risk. Too little debt, you're moving backwards relative to the finish line. Does that make sense?
It does. It's interesting because you're not taught this in high school. You're not taught about investing in a financial, maybe at a basic level, but if the stock market's historically 8% return and now all of a sudden you're in a 40% tax bracket.
Yep.
Well, hey, you're losing.
Yep. That's exactly correct. And that's the part that we're all so conditioned to think in terms of dollars coming in, but not in terms of purchasing power. What can we buy? So that's why you'll notice a lot of investors were able to buy certain things 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Now they can't afford it, but they've been making money all these years. It's because their purchasing power is going down, how much they can buy, but they're making money, and it's not good. It's not keeping up with this formula here. So that's why it's really important to know this, what we call break-even return, what I call the secret formula, is so critical. You start with this, and then you build off of that.
Interesting. Okay. Now, when it comes to debt in your third book, you talk about 4 teams. Can you expand on that?
So in the third book, when I talk about this formula here, I talk about relative to this, there are
Mhm.
four types of people in the world. There are those that pay interest for everything. And those are the people that are always using their credit cards and they're using different things and they're always in debt, but bad type of debt. And they're making everyone wealthy. Then there's the people that don't use debt for anything and they pay cash for everything. And they are always moving backwards because of this formula here. Their purchasing power over time is going down. They don't. They might invest their money in certain things, but they're not. Let me see. Let me take that back. These people are not investing or anything. Just everything is cash, and they don't use debt. So they're moving backwards relative to the finish line. The third ones are the ones that don't use debt, but they invest their money, so they earn interest. So they might take, they don't believe in debt, so they invest in mutual funds and even real estate, but without using debt. And so they are still moving backwards because they have to beat this break even, right? And it's very difficult to do that. So they're moving backwards but slower. And the fourth type of person is the one that creates spreads. They use debt strategically and then they make more money from it. So, like real estate investors. But what happened is they're the ones making the spreads. So what they do is they play the game the best, and they're the only ones in this whole system moving forward. And if you think about how banks work, banks actually do that. They're playing the spread game. And so it's not about lending, it's strictly about spreads. Because spreads allow you to do what I talked about in part one, pass on the negative negative side of inflation to the people you're borrowing money from. So as an investor, you are also in the fourth category, but you have to know how to play the game right. Again, even if you have money and you're not using debt and you're just investing with all your money, you're still moving backwards relative to the finish line, but you don't know it and you don't feel it until it's too late. You get to the finish line. You have to understand the use of debt strategically, and that's really hard to get. But it's a big shift here because we're all
Mhm.
told invest but don't use debt. Now you see why Robert Kiyosaki has been right all this time because when you look at this mathematically into this formula here, you realize how right he was. And I was, I grew up believing debt is bad, but there is no other way to beat the financial system without using debt strategically. But you have to know how to use it.
It's amazing. It's a mind blown philosophy of getting to that fourth team level, and
Yep.
creating those spreads. And
Yep.
I didn't quite hear about that for the longest time in that arbitrage and using it correctly. So going back to using it correctly, is that when you talk about, not leveraging too much, not leveraging too little, but just the right amount where,
Correct.
a property's still going to debt service.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So just to expand on that, Scott, because you said something here. I want to make sure people get that. So as long as something debt service that but that's not necessarily what we're talking about because you could have in the book Wealthy Code I talk about um, negative leverage, positive
Mm-hmm.
leverage, and neutral leverage. So you can technically cash flow but still have negative leverage. Your loan constant can still be just from part one. We talked about this. Your loan constant can still be higher than the cap rate, and yet you're still cash flowing. You want to actually take it a step further by doing not just cash flowing, but have positive leverage. And that's the key there. And so in part one, we talked about the loan constant being less than the cap rate. That is
Mm-hmm.
so critical and having reserves and fixed interest rate and all that stuff. So these are the building blocks of being able to be on the fourth team. So it's not just about cash flowing, it's about having positive leverage as well.
So I think you use the example in the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you talk about fixed debt going out, let's say 30 years, and what you really are looking for is that appreciation as well, where there's this you're paying too much interest, not enough principal, and then there's this curve that kind of flows with each other, where you're getting the cash flow, but you're also getting the appreciation at the same rate, which makes your return greater.
Correct. So, um, if you remember, we talked about the six buckets for assets. So all buckets can be placed into one of six buckets. So let's go over the six buckets really quickly. So in bucket number one, so imagine three on top and three in the bottom. Okay, the three buckets on top are growth only assets. That means you buy something, you wait for it to go up in value. Income only, which is like a note or private lending, and both, like real estate, where you have both growth and income. Now, on the top row, the top three assets, top three buckets on top are for stable assets. You can have the same thing for volatile assets. Okay. Now, going back to your question, in the example you're giving, you have growth and you have income, so it's a both, right? Bucket. But certain times you have growth only assets, which are actually incredible if you know how to use them correctly. And then you have income assets. So income asset, for example, like private lending, is where your cap rate or your income is higher than the loan cost, and the cap rate is more than but that is a fixed spread. It doesn't change in most cases. Okay. In growth, you want to have exponential growth, and you want to have interest rate, not loan cost, but the interest rate lower than that. So, for example, if the asset is growing at 8%, but the cost of money is 5%, you're fine. And it has to be a certain type of debt, which is called accruing debt. So again, depending on which bucket we're talking about. So the example you gave is for a stable asset that's both growth and income. Now, the challenge with what I'm just saying with all this, Scott, is that investors need to know these six buckets because most investors think I need to buy real estate. They're not looking at what about other assets. So that's why you have to look. You have to see it as a financing game, because depending on what asset, what bucket it fits in, you can structure it differently. So what you said applies to both growth and income, and stable assets.
It's amazing. I love the bucket. It's a visual. You can see it. So let's talk about the 3 high-level steps in raising private money.
So in raising money, which is obviously very, very important, the 3 main steps are, number one, and every investor needs to learn how to raise money. Big pictures, 3 steps. Number one is get in front of the right audience. So step 1 is right audience. Step 2 is the right script, know what to say. Mm-hmm. And step 3 is the right deal. So again, right audience. Don't waste your time with the wrong audience. And we should really expand on each one of those. Right script, know exactly what to say and have that prepared. Mm-hmm. And the right deal for the right person, for the right audience. These are the 3 steps in raising money.
So who is the right audience?
That's a great question. So the right audience would be high net worth individuals, what I call busy professionals. And these are people making money, but they're so busy, they don't have time to look at things like this, right? At investing. So you have to solve a problem for them. So they have the capital, they have the money to invest, but they have also a big problem. So for example, doctors, let's talk about doctors. I've seen doctors that are making great money. However, they're so in a bad place because they're so busy. They don't have time to even think about investments, right? A lot of busy professionals, again, high net worth busy professionals there's so many of them out there. So that's where I tell people, focus on the right audience, and that's the right audience. So once you understand the right audience, the next question is, where can I find them? So you want to know what they read, you want to know where they are, go there and get in front of them. So that's the right audience. And we'll talk about the right script here in a minute, but make sure you know everything about them, know where they hang out, and go there.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the best practices for the right script?
So for the right script, you wanna know what to say. And so one of the things I tell people is don't ask for the money. Okay, don't ask for the money. And one of the things that ties into the right deal is they care more about a safer deal than the return. So in other words, if I'm talking to you about a deal and I tell you that there are two deals, one deal over here, deal A pays you 12%, but it's high risk and you could lose your principal. And the other deal over here pays 9%, but it's extremely low risk and it's relatively safe. Most people will pick 9% because they care more about the safety than the return. So once you understand that, you have to focus on talking about the safety. So you want to share with them why it's structured so safe. And so most people always talk about returns, but you have to also add in there the steps you've taken to lower the risk and make it a safer deal. So these are some of the things, the guidelines in the script that you have to think about is, and really focus on their pain, solving their pain. So a lot of their pain is that, if they don't have enough passive income or they don't have retirement, focus on fixing their problem, not your problem, right? So again, don't ask for the money, but frame the conversation to allow them to ask you to be in the deal. Number two, make sure you talk about the safety, not just the return, how you structure it for low risk. And third, frame the conversation in terms of solving a problem for them, not for you personally.
Interesting. I love that, knowing that you have to start with the right audience, right? In solving problems and figuring solutions. That's amazing. That's very helpful. So,
Scott, just to add what you're saying there, as part of understanding the audience, you have to, in step one, you have to understand where they're coming from in terms of their problems and the challenges. The more you research them, the more you understand how to frame the script and the conversation. So important.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Now, George, are there any other talking points that you want to discuss, within the Banker's Code and the Debt Millionaire?
So one thing I tell people is understand the big picture first, and understand what you're trying to do. What I mean by that is it's not about the asset. The asset only allows you to use debt and financing strategically to help you move forward. But there are some ratios and some metrics you have to be looking at because you don't want to take on too much risk, especially if you're raising money from friends and family. I've seen people, I met a gentleman in one of the talks I was having. He walked up to me and he told me that he had raised $1 million and from friends and family, and within 2 years had lost the whole $1 million and all the properties he bought. And so, you think about that for a second. I mean, things will never be the same with that family. He just lost all their hard-earned money and all the assets, all because he didn't take the time to learn how to structure this correctly. That $1 million, if he had taken the time to learn to structure the deals, could have changed his whole entire life and helped him elevate all his family and friends as well in the process. But just remember that whenever we're talking about raising money, you have to understand it's a lot more than just raising money. You have a responsibility to do what's best for everyone in terms of low risk, in terms of what's best for them, not just for you as well. And that's your responsibility as an investor. You have to take the time and learn these things because that time to learn these things can have such a huge impact financially for everyone. So take the time to learn that. And people are putting money with you because they've assumed you've done your job in learning this stuff. So it's such a huge responsibility. It's not something you should take lightly. So I tell people, take the time, learn about capital structures, learn about structuring deals, learn about the formula we just talked about, and understand what's the ultimate objective for you. Obviously, to get to retirement and be able to retire sooner than later, but also, you have a bigger obligation for your family and friends if you're doing this and raising money from them. So,
Well, I think that's great advice, and there's such deep wisdom in there, and we have such great technology today that we can read books from a Kindle, or and I'm sure that's why you're giving back with your books, is you're trying to help and educate people. Same thing with the podcast. You can educate yourself, and that's so important, especially when your first couple deals are probably going to be your friends and family that are going to be investing with you, and
yep.
you have that right, and that's great to arm yourself with that knowledge, because once you have it, then you can see through the fog and come to that clear picture.
Yep, very, very, very important. I love reading books. I think they're incredibly important, and the fact that people are reading it is just even better for me.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, no, it's great, and I highly recommend the books. I mean, and George, you just have a great writing style. You talk about topics that really aren't talked about, and the way you explain them, it's clear, and you can see it, and it makes you think on that higher level. It's that mindset shift when you're clinging page by page. So I enjoyed each one.
oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, so why don't we wrap up the second interview? Thank you so much for being on the show again. I love, I'm learning from you right now, and I think that's very important to know. It's amazing to continue to learn, with it's amazing authors. And I'm definitely going to link in the show notes to where to purchase your books and your website. And, you have any last words for the listeners?
You know what? I just want to say this. My last words would be, investing is an incredible game. I love that, Robert Kiyosaki talked about it being a game. I get it now. And it is such an incredible game, but just realize in playing this game, you're going to have good days and you're going to have bad days. And you're going to have more bad days in the beginning, but those bad days are going to make you so much better as an investor. And so just realize overall the big picture, don't give up, keep going, realize that it is a game. And, at the end of our lives, you're going to look back and you're going to say one of two things. Either I wish I did it or I'm glad I did it. And my recommendation to you is take the time, learn it, and be glad you did it. It's an incredible game. It is a game that we all can win. We just have to help each other and share the knowledge, but also just realize that you're going to have bad days. You will never have the opportunity to have all good deals. You're going to have bad deals, but every bad deal, cherish it because it's going to make you a better investor. And try to avoid thinking that get rich overnight. It's not going to happen. But you are leaping forward over time as you learn and as you do. And keep the conversation going with people in your circles about investing. It's so important you surround yourself with the right people, and especially with podcasts like this. So Scott, again, thanks so much for having me. Really, really appreciate you for that.
Well, thank you very much for your time, George. Really appreciate it. You have yourself a great day, all right?
You too. Take care.
Thank you. And that concludes our Part 2 book club interview with author George Antone on the Banker's Code and the Debt Millionaire. In this book, it's a story of a brilliant scientist and thinker who shares with the author and with you incredible financial secrets passed down through generations. It's a story that chronicles the most powerful wealth-building strategies known to man, lessons that are the basis of banking. You'll be introduced to a whole new way of building wealth that some of the wealthiest families in the world have used and are still using to be the banker. I highly recommend you get out and get a copy of The Banker's Code and also The Debt Millionaire. This is just such a great book. It's kind of on that same line as Rich Dad Poor Dad, where you're reading it and it automatically turns your thinking right around. It's a great book, and I make sure that I leave some information in the show notes where you can pick your copy up today and find out more about George. Make sure you like us on Facebook, hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date to the authors we're interviewing and the books we're reading so you can learn right alongside us. My name is Scott, your host, and we'll see you next time.